big data, and archives. So we're just so happy to have you here and excited as well because today is going to be a discussion on computational ethnography and how it applies, either in archives or any other places. So with that being said, I just want to say as well, thank you to Jacqueline, who's coming to us from the University of Arizona. And just some kind of structural thing, we just want to make sure that you know that all the questions, if you have questions, please, you're going to put them in the Q&A. And then after our presenter is done with her presentation, then we'll have time to kind of read aloud your questions. With that being said, I just want to also say that thank you so much and good morning. Just have time to go into the chat and say hello to each one another. And we know that this time around, we are definitely living difficult times, and we want to understand and say that we stand by Black Lives Matter in this period, and then we stand in solidarity. And for all those of you out there, our colleagues, Black people, the way you're living emotionally, we just hope that, you're gonna get through this, and then that the time will come, right, when we're gonna see the end of it and say, hey, it was worthwhile, something good came out of this. I'm Rebecca Bayek, one of your moderators here from the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and I'm joined here by my colleague Asia Stewart from the New York University Library. So without further ado, it's time now for our presenter to go into our discussion for today. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here, and I'm happy to be talking about computational ethnography today. So my name is Jackie Joslyn. I'm from the University of Arizona. And yeah, I've been invited to talk about computational ethnography. It's a pretty big development in ethnographic and archival types of research. I have a very strong background in social network analysis in particular. Now, the research that I'm presenting here, many of the data that I'm using are part of a study that we did on terminally ill cancer patients. And we use a lot of arrays to visualize our data. But in this study, or in this presentation, I'm going to be talking a little bit about that study. First, I'm going to start by explaining the value of computational ethnography. And then I'm going to go on to discuss how we used arrays in our research and how this can be used for different types of qualitative modeling and analysis. And then I'm going to touch on some other types of computational ethnography to help put all this into perspective. So some of the data that I'm using here are taken from this study that we had on terminally ill cancer patients and how they made decisions. This is based on a paper that we wrote called The Promises of Computational Sociology. And my co-authors on the paper are listed here. Corey Abramson in particular was instrumental in co-authoring the paper. This research was funded by PCORI and the NIH. So if I express any opinions, those are my opinions and not the opinions of my funders. Now, when we talk about ethnography, we're talking about something that kind of complements this other paradigm. So ethnography operates within the normal scientific tradition, which we just call NST for short. Okay, and NST tends to emphasize things like hypothesis testing, collecting a lot of data, and usually generalizing these data to some larger population. Ethnography sort of complements NST. Ethnography includes a very wide variety of methods and techniques, but the thrust of ethnographic research is usually to develop some sort of set of theories or propositions, more so than outright hypothesis testing. And this is also true for archival types of research. So it could be used to describe or to observe different types of mechanisms or different theoretical nuances. It's usually exploratory and it's highly precise. So neither ethnography nor NST are perfect. But because NST is widely accepted as sort of the status quo, there has been a lot of increasing pressure on historians and ethnographers and other types of qualitative researchers to address some key concerns within traditional qualitative methods. So that is what really the goal of computational ethnography is to help address some of these concerns and help us to operate within this broader paradigm. So with qualitative types of research, it tends to be very exploratory. You're going out, you're collecting a lot of different types of data, and not necessarily in a systematic way. You might make it as systematic as you can, down in the archives when you're collecting any kind of, material that you can collect, or when you're out doing interviews with people and you don't have a very structured type of interview schedule. But it's mostly very exploratory. It tends to be kind of anecdotal. You're focusing a lot on experiences. You're focusing a lot on very complex processes, and you're trying to observe all of this information. And it tends to be relatively opaque because you have so much information, and it's very difficult to share that information. So the upshot is, what we're trying to do here is make our research a little more scalable, a little more generalizable. Oftentimes we have a very small sample size. We might not be observing very many people, or we might just have so much data that it's difficult to really summarize it and generalize it in some way. We want to make our research a little bit more transparent. We want people to be able to know, why are we drawing these conclusions? What kind of, what are we basing this on? We want to try to make this data as transparent as we can, given that, when you're going out there, you're absorbing all kinds of new information. It's ethnographic research is very much experiential research. You're talking to different types of people, and it's just so much information, and we do the best we can taking field notes and summarizing our data, but at the end of the day, it's difficult to truly show somebody everything that you've learned from that research. So computational ethnography helps us to organize our data and make it a little bit more transparent. And then we want to try to, we struggle with this, but we want to try to make our research a little bit more replicable. And having some sort of computation, some systematic procedures for doing, for visualizing or for analyzing our data does help us to make it a little bit more replicable. Now, anytime we're doing qualitative research, usually we're intersecting with some very specific time or some very specific place, some very specific culture, and it's very difficult to replicate everything that happened in that time. But this helps, to make it a little bit more replicable, at least with the data that we have. Okay, so yeah, the goal here is to develop, visualization and analytic techniques that can be used to identify different patterns in our data. It helps to deal with the fact that we don't always have a lot of cases that we're dealing with. So aggregating information helps to increase that generalizability. And we want to use systematic formal procedures and calculations. And we want to allow our data to be shared and to be replicated a little more easily. And particularly, if you're dealing with the issue of anonymity, if you're doing actual human subjects research, you also want to be able to share that data without, violating your human subjects requirements. So this is just a brief overview of some of the data that we're using. I am going to be using other types of data. I know that many people here do historical types of research, but the data is essentially similar to what you might find in archives anyway. The difference is that we collected it using interviews with living people. So this was a 5-year study. There's about 96 patients that we interviewed and observed. 31 caregivers, 63 providers. It's a pretty substantial size for an ethnographic study. We did observations in, 6 clinics, boardrooms, people's houses. There's, it amounted to about over 12,000 pages of text data. So this is very much a text analysis that we were aiming to do here. So we used a variety of coding techniques to code our data, and I'll get a little bit more into that right now. So we used, all of our analysis started in Atlas.ti. Now, Atlas.ti costs money. You do have to pay for a subscription, and it's not cheap. But it's a little cheaper if you're a student, though. If you could get your students to, to get Atlas.ti, and if you want to assign them to do this type of work, that might be a good option for you if you have a research team. But we coded our data in Atlas.ti. There are other options available, and I'll get more into the software programs and stuff later on after I review all of this. But yeah, Atlas.ti is probably the best software you could get for coding, in my opinion. There are a lot of other types of softwares. I think some of them are free, but Atlas.ti is really great. It has great exporting options, so you could export the data to different places. And, it's very organized. Now, you have to upload your documents in some, type of format that Atlas can read, usually, a document or, like a DOC document or a text document or something like that. And then you just go through, you code different paragraphs, different words, you assign them to different categories, and then you can export that text data in the form of frequencies, like how often a given person said a given thing, which is what we did here. So here in the rows, you can see we have different subjects, different people in our study. And then in each column, we have a code which indicates what that person was talking about. So if they were talking about something related to, their current caregiver, then then we mark that as, one frequency. So this is a count of how often people talked about different things. So now how you interpret text data like this, it varies from person to person. In our case, we thought, well, is there a big difference? If somebody says something 6 times as opposed to 8 times, and we decided probably not. It's probably just the case that some people are just more talkative than other people. So instead, we decided to code it either with binary data, meaning that we had zeros if they said nothing at all, and 1 if they said something. So that's one way that we coded it. We also sometimes coded it with trinary data. So we would code 0 if they said nothing, 1 if they said something once, and 2 if they said it more than once. And then we use that to create our arrays. So this is an array down here, okay, and it's from this research article if you want to go check it out some other time. An array is just basically a heat map. Okay, there's a lot of different words for an array. In this case, it's called an Ethnoarray because we're using ethnographic data. But that's basically, what an array looks like. So arrays, well, in this case, we have subjects down here. Let me just explain what we have here. And then up here, we have attributes and, different types of text data. So in this case, when you look at it, you can see a broader structure. And when you color code things, you can zoom out and you can see those broader structures. When you're just looking, at this, you're just looking at it and it's, it's just a lot of numbers. So this color coding, it makes it easy to zoom out, to look at the broader structure of your data, to generalize it a little bit more, and to see clear patterns in your data. Okay, so this is conducive for studying larger sample sizes. So in this case, we had, I think, 96 patients in our sample, and we used a clustering algorithm to create different typologies. So that's one thing that clustering is really useful for, is helping to classify your data into different types. And it can also be useful for supporting your propositions or for visualizing your hypotheses. So in this case, we hypothesized that patients would have altruistic motives for joining experimental cancer treatment trials. Okay, but however, we see this big, large, horizontal red band here, right at the bottom. And this is showing us that very few people actually chose to participate for altruistic reasons. We have zeros there. That's basically a big band of zeros where people said nothing about joining experimental trials for altruistic reasons. So here we were able to visualize how our hypotheses were actually incorrect. That particular hypothesis was incorrect. Now, we also ideally would be able to zoom in on the data. This is a little bit trickier. If you're going to do something like this, you're going to have to have some programming background because there isn't really anything prepackaged that you can use to do this. But ideally, you would be able to take your mouse, you can run over a cell in your array, and then a piece of evidence would pop up, like a quote. So if we're talking about, so here we're structuring our data with our subjects on top, and then we have time 1, time 2, time 1, time 2 for each subject. So we're looking at 2 different time periods for each subject so we can compare between then and now. And then here on the side, we show different measurements that we were using, and then we categorize them into different types of measures. So this is a lot of data that we're elegantly able to show using an array. It's very difficult to show all these complex data types, these different levels of data outside of a standard spreadsheet style format. And so arrays help us to preserve that complexity without making the model difficult to read. And that's one of the advantages of this, is its simplicity, relatively speaking, and being able to share this data. Now, we did not cluster this data. This is just the raw data, okay? And so if we ran our mouse over here, ideally we would have here, high social capital, we would have an example of how person 4021 in time period 1 demonstrated that they lack high social capital. Okay, so here it's blue, which means that they don't have something. This person is, we would have a quote pop up, and that would provide evidence for that, and so on down the line. Here you can, run over different cells, and you can see exactly why we coded it the way that we did. So this helps address the issue of transparency. It allows us to share data without revealing the identities of our subjects, and in a way that would be that we could use to share data online. It's useful for the digital age. If you want to share data openly, make it available to other people, you would be able to post this online so that people can really dig into your data and see what you did. Now, anytime you're doing something with color, there's the issue of how you're going to publish it, because some journals only publish in black and white. So you have a couple of options here. Your first option is you could just use a grayscale. You don't have to use color at all. If it's easier for you, you can just use a grayscale. But in this case, we decided to use a colorblind palette. And that's also kind of nice to do anyway, because colorblind people are out there and they might not be able to interpret your data if you're not using a colorblind palette. So in this case, that's what we did. And we just have, a bunch of our attribute data and subjects here. And see, we have your colored interpretation here, violet, yellow, pale green, and what all that represents. But if you decided to print it out and you wanted to print it out in black and white, you could still interpret it, because we have our grayscale interpretation at the bottom. That the lightest color, if you print it out, is going to be violet, followed by yellow, and then the darkest would be pale green. Okay, so it's a helpful thing to do. Now, there's other colorblind types of options, or black and white options, that you can use if you're using something other than the heat map function. And I'll show you an example of that a little bit later. Oh yeah, here, actually, I'll show you an example of that right now. So here we have different lines. We have lines facing down towards the left and lines that go down towards the right. And this is a different program. Before I was using heat map right here. Oops, I was using heat map up here. And this time I was using core plot, you know, a correlation diagram. And those are just different ways of modeling the exact same thing. So here, you know, if you print it out, the green is all going to be the downward, you know, lines, and downward to the left lines, and downward to the right lines are going to be the purple squares. Okay, and then they're shaded, so that's just going to show up if you print it in black and white. Okay, now I included a couple links here in case you want to learn more about these functions. All this was done in R. All of the arrays that we did were done in R. And you do have to learn a little bit about R before you actually can make the arrays. It looks very complicated, and I'm going to show you exactly, you know, how I went about it. Once you get past that steep learning curve in R, it becomes a little easier to model these things. But just know that you have more than one option. There are other types of functions available. There might even be more than just this. These are the two that I've used. And yeah, there are different words for an array. Some people call an ethnoarray, a heat map, a correlogram. If you're Googling something, you could try using a variety of different terms to learn more about it. Try different types of programs and see what really fits your data. But yeah, so, you know, here it's, you know, a similar type of interpretation, but instead of having our columns and our rows, we have just the information right down the center line. So education and credentials have a very high correlation with each other. Okay, so correlograms were really designed for correlation data. When you're correlating two variables together and then plotting that data. With our heat map, we were really using raw data. But that doesn't mean you can't use correlation data with a heat map. And you might be able to also use raw data with a correlogram. It's been a while since I used it, but I think that you can. So here it's positive correlations in green and negative correlations in purple. And then the lighter shaded purple means less of a negative correlation. The darker shade means more of a correlation. So it's pretty neat, you know, it's a pretty neat diagram. Okay, I'm going to now show you my R screen, and we'll run through some, let me pull that up. I have so many screens up right now. Let me just exit real quick. Okay. Oh, here we go. Okay, that's not the bottom. All right, so here we go. So I'm going to show you, actually, let me show you real quick what data I'm using. So I made this up completely. My partner is into, you know, watching crime, you know, true crime stuff. So, so let's say that we have a bunch of people in our columns, person A, person B, etc. And then we have the crime that they committed, crime 1, crime 2, crime 3. And we just collected a bunch of data, okay? And zeros represent when somebody did not commit a crime, and ones are when they did commit a crime. Very simple binary type of data. This is how you might normally set up your spreadsheet. You might have people maybe on top, or people to the subjects, you know, down here, and then some kind of attribute, you know, either on top or to the side here. Or you could have, you know, two groups of people. It could be a group of people here and a group of people there. And in that case, what you would have is a relational data set. If you have, you know, just a normal style data set would just be people and attributes, or, you know, something like that. But a relational data set is where you have, you indicate whether two groups of people have a relationship to each other, or whether people have relationships within a group, or people have affiliations with an organization, or something like that. But here we just have a standard type of, attribute-based data set. Okay, so every good research starts with a spreadsheet, it starts with a data set, and then from there you could do your computations. Now you might need some other program like Atlas to be able to get frequency data, or to do, or some other kind of program to be able to do correlations or something like that. And that's fine, you can always, you can start there. And then export your data to some kind of a CSV file or whatever. So, okay, so here we have R. When I'm doing my heat map function, when I'm running that, I'm using gplots. So you can install gplots up here, install packages, and then you can install it. And then you have to call it from your library. And then I'm uploading my data set here, and then I'm going to, mess around with it, because you always have to mess around with your data before you can plot it. So I'm going to turn it into a data frame. I'm going to turn that into a matrix, and that's just technicalities. And then I have a color palette. I'm deciding to use black for zeros and red for the number 1. And then we're just gonna run our heat map, and this is what we end up with. Okay. We see here that we have, it's very visually appealing. You can easily see, you can distinguish the zeros from the ones. And it looks like we have some kind of pattern here. But, one of the goals of modeling these heat maps is being able to reduce our own bias. So this looks like an interesting looking pattern, right? Kind of a diamond shape. But what does this even mean? And are we just playing tricks on ourselves? How can we remove this natural tendency to see patterns and things? And that's where the clustering algorithm is also really helpful. So let's try doing that. Let's just cluster our rows. So we're going to run this section, and there we go. We got our rows clustered here. And so this just rearranges everything based on how dissimilar the cells are. So here at the bottom, at our first iteration, we split the thing in two. We split our matrix in two. And we have the people or the crimes on the bottom here where, very few people committed them. And then we have the crimes on the top where a lot of people committed them. And so these are very different from each other. The algorithm decided, yes, this is a big difference. And then they split our matrix there to create two general categories. And then on the next iteration, it split it into a more nuanced category, more specific category, where here it says, okay, this long line for crime 5 is way different than these crimes for up here, okay? And then it split it even further. And at the end of the day, it gave us 5 different categories of crimes. So this is very useful if you want to create a typology, or if you're trying to test a model that you had in mind. If you're saying, okay, I'm imagining that there's 5 different types of crimes, and I think that they're different in this way, and you want to test to see whether that has some merit to it, you could do this clustering algorithm, okay? So, and then you don't just have to do rows, you could also do columns, and you can end up with very different information. Now, our matrix is symmetric, so what you're gonna see is, the same thing, just pivoted a little bit. Yeah, you end up with still a very different set of information, because now we end up with 5 different categories of people. Okay, so we can now describe 5 different types of people who commit crimes. Okay, so this is very, very different information, even though and it's just a matter of which you're deciding to cluster, whether it's the rows or the columns. Okay, now notice here that you're not ending up with an elegant upside down pyramid looking thing. You end up with this really weird, human looking figure. That's because the algorithm is not sorting the data. It's just clustering the data. It's not paying attention to how it looks. It's just doing what it's supposed to do. You know, and it's important to understand what your algorithm is doing when you choose an algorithm, or when you're using one. Understand what its limitations are. So if we're looking for a very elegant sorted type of model here, we're not going to get that. What we're going to get is categories. That's what it's going to give us. And it doesn't necessarily say, okay, this category is more similar to this category, so I'm going to group these together. So it's not necessarily going to do that for you. Now, if you did want to do that, you could do a sorting. You could just sort it. You can do some kind of sorting algorithm before you run the heat map. You can change this to false, so that way, you know, it's not running any kind of clustering algorithm like I did up here. You could just use a basic heat map, do a basic heat map, and then it'll show your sorted data without ruining it by clustering it. So you would have to sort the data first and then run your heat map function without the clustering option engaged. Okay, so, and then you can also run both, as we'll do right now. So you end up with this kind of weird looking, you know, hood shape here. And this is, you know, this is splitting it more into quadrants. So we end up with another different type of typology, and we get a little bit more of some nuance here in our data. We could see that half of the individuals committed, half of the individuals here committed the same 3 types of crime. They all committed crime 5, 4, sorry, my screen is in the way, or the one on top. So you can see that there's an interesting pattern there. We could draw some conclusions about that. And then we could see that half of the crimes also were committed by the same 3 people, right? Person E, person D, and person F, all committed about at least half the crimes. So that tells us something interesting about our data. And then we can also see, when we look into these other quadrants, that, you know, there are certain people who never commit crimes. Person J and person A just never seem, and person I, they never really seem to commit any crimes. And then there's certain crimes that people just never seem to commit. Crime 9, crime 1, nobody seems interested in doing those crimes today. So, so it's kind of interesting, you know, depending on how you cluster it, you can get a lot of different information to construct your typologies or to validate them. All right, so let me go back to my PowerPoint. Okay, so now there are different types of computational methods out there. And I'm just going to run through some of them just for comparison. All of them are really aimed to help to, you know, improve the scalability, the transparency, and the replicability of research. Some of them are more successful in some ways than others. I've talked a lot about how arrays are really useful for modeling, but there's other options out there too. So let's just take a look here at our word cloud, which is a very common thing. You see it everywhere. A lot of people can do it on the internet, you know, on Facebook. I see people making their own word clouds. We made this in Atlas.ti. There's a lot of software programs that allow you to do that. And it's very visually interesting to look at. It captures your attention. And it's a very useful aid with storytelling and things like that. But it does obviously have some limitations. So here, this was done with our cancer patient data set. We could see that patients talked a lot about things like time, you know, how they feel, what their treatment is like, about cancer. And so, you know, it gives us some information about our data. Now, we can't, there's limitations to what we can do with this. We can't really test a lot of hypotheses with this. It's useful as a storytelling aid, but a lot of our information is kind of lost here. It's not very transparent. It isn't telling us a lot about the data source. You know, where are we getting our analysis from? It's pretty limited, but it does have that visual appeal to it. So it has that shock factor to it, and that could be useful in certain types of cases. And then we have social network analysis, and this covers a very wide range of methods. Okay, and I could go and you know, talk more about any of these methods in the Q&A if you would like to learn more about them. But here we just have a very standard sociogram, which consists of lines and dots. The lines indicate whether or not there's a relationship, and the dots indicate different social actors or whatever you want them to represent. In this case, we have what we call two-mode data, which means we're using data on individuals and we're using data on something else. And in this case, we're talking about attributes. So normally with social network analysis, what it's really designed to do is to look at relational data. So what we were talking about before, how you would have, you know, how people within a group are interconnected to each other, or how two groups are connected to each other, or how people are affiliated with organizations, how they're affiliated with different events, anything like that. It's a little bit more rare to use social network analysis to model people and attributes, but it is possible to do that. You could be as creative as you want with these methods. There's no real hard rules in what kind of data you're using. You know, try to, you know, find a method that really works for your data. In this case, it's a little bit of, it's a little messy. I would normally recommend having so many different options engaged on your social network analysis. But I did this one in R, and what we have is our patient data. The circles represent individuals, and the squares represent attributes, and we're looking at how those things are connected. Okay, and I did a cohesive analysis to look at the cohesion of the nodes. And so the purple ones are the ones that have the most number of ties, and they're more cohesively connected. They are more towards the middle. And as you go further out to the outskirts, these are the ones that have the fewest ties. They are less part of the group. They're more in the rural kind of area. Okay. And it creates sort of a core periphery structure. All right. And then we have these different zones. So we have the blue zone in the middle, and then the green, and then the red. And this is done spatially. I used an algorithm called the Fruchterman-Reingold algorithm to spatially disperse the nodes and show how different the nodes are from each other. Okay. So here on the outskirts, the easiest thing to see is who had, you know, gynecological cancer. Okay, and we have two people here that had gynecological cancer, two people out here who had lung cancer, and they're kind of on the outskirts here. And that's because there's nobody really like them. They're connected to very unique attributes, and that's what makes, they're very different from the other nodes, and that's why they're on the outskirts. The nodes that are most similar to each other are closer to the middle in this blue area. Okay, so there's a lot that you can do with this. And then I'm going to show you actually really quickly UCINet. So if you're interested in doing social network analysis, you can do it in R, you can learn it in R. There's, you know, pros and cons to using R. But if you are looking for a quick way of doing your network analysis, UCINet is a really good way to go. It's a one-time type of fee. You could just pay it. And if you're a student, it's only like 40 bucks. If you're not a student, it's like 150, I think, but it is a one-time payment. And, you know, anytime you switch computers, you could just hit them up and say, hey, I switched computers, I lost UCINet, can I download it again? And they'll give it to you. It's a very small business that owns UCINet. It's sort of a, you know, a husband and wife owned business. So it's very easy to communicate with them. Okay, so if you want to do any kind of analysis, any kind of, you know, clustering analysis or anything like that, see hierarchical analysis, you can do it right here. You could, you know, pull in your data set. You could do a dissimilarity or similarity type of algorithm. It makes it very easy, very standardized. And you have all your different measurements here. And it gives you a lot of different types of options, and it's just very easy to run. One of the things I like most about UCINet is that it has an amazing help book. And even if you just want to download the free version, UCINet actually has a free download you can use for 90 days if you just want to try it out and take a look at it. You can do that. But and if you do, I recommend checking out the help section, because it really explains a lot of the measurements that they're using. See whether should you use similarities or should you use distances, and it explains what the difference is in the calculations between those things. And it explains all the different outputs that it's giving you, all of that kind of stuff. And you go down further, and and it gives you an example of what it's going to look like. It's just a very, very good help section. So I recommend taking advantage of it. And here, all the different measurements, it tells you exactly what it's doing, what these measurements mean. So yeah, so that's one thing to do. And then it's a really great place to just explore different types of social network methods that are out there, and to ask questions and be like, what is centrality? Is this something I can use? I talked before about core periphery structure. There's different clustering tests to see whether you have a core periphery structure. There's just a huge variety of methods you can use. And here I'm going to actually be talking about multidimensional scaling. That's something that you can do here too. There's just a wide variety of things. And another great thing about this type of thing is you can, let me see if this is popped up on your screen. I think that you guys can see it. Oh, here we go. Is the network visualization. It allows you to really easily plot social network diagrams. Okay, so let me just quickly pull one up to give you an example. So they have pre-made data sets for you to use, which is pretty great. You can look at actual data from real research and see how other people plotted their data. And that's pretty cool. So we'll look at the Paget data set because that's a historical data set. So we're looking at how different families are connected. And we can look at, I think that was like financially how they were connected, and in some other way. I forget exactly what it was. So yeah, you could look at different types of ties, how they were connected in different types of ways. And you can modify it. You can modify the colors of the nodes. You can run different types of tests. It's just a really useful type of thing. So yeah, so there you go. And let me just pull up my other screen for you. Okay, so yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of different other types of methods out there. With anything like multidimensional scaling or correspondence analysis, you can, it's more of a spatial type of thing. It gets very complex when you're doing those types of studies. It's really designed a little bit more for complex data types, categorical data, and for continuous types of data where you have a lot of numbers. It is possible to do it with binary data. It might be a little less impressive, or you might get some wonky things going on. You have to be a little careful when you're doing multidimensional scaling or something like correspondence analysis. And it's also pretty complex. It achieves many of the same things that an array achieves, just it makes it look a little bit more impressive, but that also means you're gonna have to spend a little bit more space in your article talking about those methods and how to interpret them. Yeah, those types of things you can do. You could do multidimensional scaling, correspondence analysis in many different programs. You can even do them in Stata. Stata actually allows you to do those things. You could do it in R or Python, or you could do it in something like UCINet, which is a little more prepackaged. And then here, I have a Galois lattice, which is also called, formal concept analysis. So I'll go into that in a second. Let me just quickly talk about block modeling and factor analysis. So these are not really visualization techniques. They're more for analysis. Block modeling is just separating things into categories the same way we were using our clustering algorithm. It's just a different way of doing it. And factor analysis is also reducing things into categories. And all of these data, you know, if you just want to do the analysis, you don't want to deal with a visualization, then that's a really great thing to do. Again, these are things that are available in many different types of software programs, and I'll get a little bit more into that in a second. But you could also just take the data after you run the analysis. You could take the data and then you can export it to a CSV file and then model it afterwards. You don't have to do everything all at once if you don't want to. Or if you're looking for some nuance and the program doesn't allow for it, you know, you're looking for a very specialized type of algorithm, you want to cluster it in a very specific type of way, and then you could do that. You could run the clustering algorithm, export the data, and then model it the same way that you would if the data were sorted. And so, yeah, the Galois lattice. I think this is going to be something that's interesting to you guys, especially those who are doing archival types of research. And let me just show you an example. So this is a study that I did on different gospel papers from different churches and how the church was splintering and all this different stuff. So I wanted to model when did they make these different religious publications and see, you know, what kind of clusters I could come up with. So a Galois lattice is just putting things into a hierarchy. Okay, and so here we have the 1820s. If we click on it, it tells us everything in that lineage. Everything belongs to this lineage. See, so it's very easy to interpret different nodes. Everything belongs to this lineage, and then you can see this lineage. It's very easy to go through and see different lineages. Okay, so here we could see that when we run our mouse over it, we get what the intent is, and the intent is telling us everything that ascends from the node, all the different what they call events. So our events in this case are the dates. All right, so in the 1830s, many of the gospel papers that were printed in the 1820s were also lasting until the 1830s. If we click on the 1830s, we could see that many other journals emerged during that time period. Okay, so it runs, you know, in a very hierarchical fashion where you could see these are the journals that were around during the 1830s. Now, if we want to see what's in the 1820s, we would click on that. And then that is our extent. And those, what they call objects, in this case, they're just journals. The objects, there are two objects, right? So there's one here and one down here. So it allows us to get counts of how many things are there. So it's very useful, especially if you're doing, you know, any kind of hierarchical type of clustering models. So this is one way that you could use it. And let me just show you how that data set looks just for your own purposes. Now you're not going to run this like a normal data set. If you're doing a hierarchical clustering thing in Connex, and Connex is the name of the software that I was using there. If you're doing anything like that, you're going to have to structure your data set appropriately. And this is true anytime you do an analysis with computational ethnography. You really have to understand how the data is being used. And so here I was looking at during what dates, during what, you know, time periods was the journal around. So this journal, the Christian Baptist, started in the 1820s and it stopped publishing in the 1830s. All right, and then you could go so on down the line and you know, do that, and then it'll put it into categories and tell you what dates each journal was around for. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. Now, another really cool thing about this is that you can modify your data a little bit, and let me just show you. You can modify your data a little bit and get a very different result. So here, I took the starting date and then I just ran ones all the way through to the very end. And what this is going to give us here, the starting date to the very end, you know, and the starting date to the very end. And what this is going to give us is more of a timeline. Okay, so see, it's very, and we're just going to add some, we'll add our labels here. They have all different types of options on the side there. And here, if we wanted to, we could just have a simple timeline. And that's really nice. It's just easy to run. You know, I know it's difficult sometimes to do timelines, you know, but this makes it really easy to do. So, you know, that's one way you could use it. And then there's different ways you can analyze this. This is something that you could look into if you're interested in something like this, where you see the different size of the nodes are indicating how many articles were there at a given time period. And so that can actually facilitate your analysis if you're trying to see, well, what was the most active time period? And then you could just look at the nodes and see different patterns. So that's kind of cool. So that's why I'm spending some time on Connex. It's kind of a unique software program. It's not for everyone. You don't get a lot of nuance in your data. You have to have binary data if you're going to use it. That's one limitation of it. So if you're using something with more continuous data or categorical data, it's not going to be as useful for you. You really have to separate those into 1, 0 types of variables. All right, so yeah, and so here's just some resources for you. I do a lot of my work in Microsoft Excel. I think it's easy to use. A lot of us have it on our computers anyway. It's a great way to collect your data. Some people prefer other types of programs, and that's fine too. But a CSV file, you usually can't go wrong with a CSV file. Most types of software programs will accept a CSV file and convert it into whatever type of file that it uses. Here's a link to Atlas.ti. Yeah, it's a really great type of program if you can afford it. And here's a link also to some alternatives that I found. I just did a Google search and found some alternatives. And you know, there's some that you might want to look into. And then if when it comes to coding or collecting data and modifying data, if these methods are not really, if Atlas isn't for you, or if some kind of Atlas alternative isn't for you, you can always try doing it by hand, the old-fashioned way. And there's, you know, I know a person in our department, you know, she's approaching retirement, and, you know, her whole life was done without, you know, without computers. It's possible to do. And I know that if you're collecting archives in a very rural area, or if you don't have access to a computer, if you're in a location where you just don't have a lot of access to a computer, or if you're dealing with documents that aren't digitalized, then it might be your only option to do it manually. And if you're going to do something like that, you could just try to make copies and then use highlighters or colored tabs to categorize your data. If you can get it into a digital format, you could use Adobe Reader, and then you can highlight and color everything. Or you could type notes on your documents into Microsoft Word, save it as a PDF, and then do all of that in Adobe Reader. That might make it a little easier. If you're doing pictures, it's also possible to do this with pictures if you're using visual data, or if you're just taking pictures of documents. You know, when I did archival research, I was just taking pictures of pages, so I didn't have to take notes on them. And you can do that. You can do something maybe in Paint, you know, some kind of standard program that comes with your computer. And you know, how you code your data, you know, it depends on you and what you're looking for. You can count different frequencies or whatever you would like to do. So that's an option. It's a time-consuming option, and probably, you know, it may or may not save you money. It depends. If you're making a lot of paper copies, I could see that really adding up for your price. But if you're using something like Adobe Reader, it could very well save you some money. It won't save you any time, but it will save you some money. And now there's certain programs that I just call Jackknife programs. They're just good at so many different things that it's useful to have them on hand. And if you can learn how to use one of these programs, then you won't have to use other more specialized types of programs. And there's pros and cons to that. One of the cons is that these programs are a little difficult to learn, especially if you're not used to using, you know, software programs for statistical analysis or something along those lines. If you've never used this type of thing before or have very little experience with it, you haven't taken a lot of classes on it, then it's going to be it's going to be a learning process for you. But there's nothing wrong with investing that time into it if that's something that you want to make room for in your professional, you know, development. So there's R, and then there's Python. R is is free. R is free. Python is also free. They're both free. And you can use them to do all kinds of different types of things. You can modify your data and do things like that with them. It's, you know, it might be easier to do it in an Excel spreadsheet, but, you know, you can, if you would like to modify your data, it allows all different types of options for you to do that. You could do visualizations, you can do different types of analysis. So it has such a wide variety of options available, and it's so flexible with whatever you want to do. If it doesn't provide, like other programs might provide limited prepackaged options, but here it gives you a lot of room to develop things. But the problem is that it's a very steep learning curve. There's a lot to learn there. So if you are going to use these programs, you really need to take the time and make the investment to learn them. But you can do very simple things very quickly, and you know, within, I would say, a month or two, you can learn how to do very basic things. And if you're looking for a very specialized thing, then I think you could learn it relatively quickly. And then you have other types of programs that there's a little less variety. It's kind of hit and miss. You might not get exactly what you're looking for as far as your computational methods go, but they do have quite a variety of things. And there's still, even though it's less flexible in how you can modify it to suit, you know, very specific, weird little niche things, usually for most people, these programs are fine. I always call it a medium learning curve. It's still pretty, it's more difficult than something like UCINet or Connex, but it's definitely easier than R or Python. So anything like SAS, SAS, or Stata, I think those ones are pretty good. And yeah, you can do data management with all of these. And then there's more specialized programs. Maybe you know exactly what you want to do and you don't really want to spend a lot of time learning how to do them. That's totally fine. There's programs out there for you. Social network analysis has all kinds of programs. UCINet is what I would consider to be the standard for easy to use social network analysis. Really great, easy to use visualization tool. It has a great help section. It is kind of buggy. Sometimes you're going to find bugs in the system where you're like, okay, that didn't do what I wanted it to do. But you know, they're constantly working on, you know, updating it and everything. So, and it is a one-time purchase. You do have to pay for it. And there's a link to it in case, you know, all the links here are provided for you in case you're interested in any of these things. Payek is, it's free, but it is harder to use. Okay, so that's an option for social network analysis. I would recommend getting some help with learning how to use it. It's, you know, I wouldn't say that it's super difficult, but it's a little bit harder than UCINet. And Jeffy or Jeffy, I'm not sure how to pronounce this. I used it like one time. It's pretty limited in its features, but it's really good for visualization and very basic network analysis. I would actually recommend it. It's free. If you're doing something very simple, it's easy to use. And then there's other types of software programs out there. Galois lattices, I use Connex, which does concept lattices. There's a link if you want to, you know, check it out. It's free. It's a little weird to use, but just read the instructions, and it's actually more straightforward than it looks. You have to install Java to your computer, and then you just click on if you're using Windows, use the connex.jar, JAR, and just click on that, and it'll pop right up, and then you can upload your data. It uploads CSV files or But the problem with uploading the CSV files is it doesn't save the CSV file. You would have to copy the CSV file and then paste it in there, and then it will save it in its own, jar or CEX format. So I also just want to note that that's something that all these programs do, these specialized programs. They save it in their own special format. So you're going to have a zillion and one different types of weird files on your computer. I think all of them allow you to upload CSV files and sometimes Excel files and other things like that. You can import that, but it's going to translate it into its own file type. Okay, so it's important to learn about what kind of file types they're using and what you need to, which file you need to click on. Now in the future, this is something that I'm doing research on, is pixel and flow analysis. I'm not going to really talk about that here, but if you're interested in learning more about it, then you can send me an email or something. I'm happy to talk about it. And this is the goal of it, is going to be able to model relational processes in terms of the way that we perceive them, the way that we perceive the relationships, how we remember things and imagine things, and how can we look at things besides just the structure of a network. How can we look at what that relationship is made up of? So now there's different options for learning computational ethnography. I'm just going to leave this here. I sent my PowerPoint to the leaders of this workshop, and they could pass this on to you, and you can check all this stuff out. So these are just some useful resources if you want to check out how to learn about these things. It is a process. Computational ethnography includes so many different methods, and it's not always simple or straightforward. So it does take some learning. And here's some literature. There's so much literature out there. There's no possible way to include all of it here. But here are some resources in case you're interested. Sage Books actually has some free books that you could view online. One of my favorite is the multiple correspondence analysis book. I thought that was really helpful when I was doing multiple correspondence analysis. And here's a link to our article on the arrays. If you want to read that, you're welcome to do that. And all these other types of resources for you. Okay. So yeah, so that's it. So yeah, the goal of computational ethnography is really to help detect patterns, to make your research more scalable, so you can generalize things a little better, so you can examine different propositions in a more systematic kind of a way, and to share your data a little bit easier with other people. And hopefully, eventually, we can find ways to allow us to share information digitally, by by being able to link to specific cells, specific types of information. That would be really great to have someday. And these methods are usually best for typologies, or talking about the distribution of your data. And then, yeah, they can also be used for exploring different types of propositions. So, yeah, so that's that. Let me just pull back up here. Okay, and I'm ready to take your questions.
Hi. Thank you so much, Jacqueline. So now we're going to transition into the question and answer portion. So if any of you guys have additional questions, please feel free to post it. I'm going to start with the first question, Jacqueline. One of the participants wanted to know what program is used for the gospel papers example that you discussed?
Okay, yeah, for that I was using, I collected all the data in Microsoft Excel, and then I used Connex, and I'm just going to type that here, Connex, and just use that software, yeah, to do the analysis.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, was that, I think that was not public.
Yeah, your share screen. No worries.
I'm getting the hang of this.
You can always add it to the list additionally as well. So the next question, one of the participants wanted to know They mentioned that you use computational methods to answer basic research questions, example, frequency of activities, that only require simple descriptive coding. Have you used computational methods for more complex qualitative approaches, such as narrative analysis? Are the terms transparency and replicability applicable to ethnographies that go in depth into meetings? It's a good question.
Yeah. Text analysis has its own wide range of methods available. I personally don't do a lot of text analysis, but it is really great to do with something like narrative types of research. There's constantly more developments being made, and I know I just showed, like, you know, a word chart, and that's a very simple type of text analysis. But there are many other types that bring into consideration, you know, the broader structure of sentences and things like that. Something like Python does have easy access to a lot of different digitalized documents. And so if you're looking to get like a ton of documents and do an analysis on that, you can do that through Python. I can't tell you all of the methods in text analysis because I don't really use them, but I can tell you that there is a lot of information out there. I would recommend maybe checking out some work. Well, I would recommend talking to experts on text analysis. They would probably know a lot better than I would, and I don't want to give, you know, wrong information, but I would say it's been done, complex analyses on text have been done using social networks. I've seen people do different conceptual types of models. It's possible to do something like that if you don't want to use the text itself and you want to look more at broader concepts. You can do that. But absolutely, you could do very complex types of research. And in fact, I would say that text analysis, looking at very complex questions and narratives, is a very popular thing to do right now. Mm-hmm. Yeah, if this person you know, really wants some resources, they can email me, and I can, there's a person in our department who does text analysis. I can contact them and try to get some resources for you. Yeah,
that would be really interesting to know, because I've used text analysis before, but used it and turned it into domain analysis. And so like one of your first charts that you use, I can see relation, how you would use the domains and then pulling the actual quotes. But any other versions of like storytelling in terms of narrative analysis, that would be really interesting to find out.
Yeah.
Anyone else have any questions? Yes, mostly in our live portion in terms of questions. I have a question though. I know you mentioned going to conferences and other things. Are there other spaces on how you learned how to do this work that you were exposed to, or was this just primarily through your graduate experience that you learned a lot about this work?
Yeah, I mean, with something like this, when it comes to like advanced methods like this, you know, you notice the further up in education you get, the less good quality pedagogy you get. The teaching, you know, kind of declines as, you know, things get more complex and people start to specialize into niche things. And this is one of those things. So a lot of it is very much going out there and just trial and error and doing the work. That's really how I learned a lot about many of these things. But I did get some very good introductions through, coursework. Luckily, our sociology department really does a lot of method stuff. That's kind of our thing, is methods. And so we do have a lot of courses there. And that's one reason I do recommend our workshop. The U of A does have workshops every year. But you know, that's paid. There's free options available. Right now I'm actually taking a course through Code Academy. They had discount options. I got a 3-month thing for free because of coronavirus related stuff. You know, if you're looking out for different discounts, many of these companies will offer discounts or scholarships at different times that make it more affordable to use their services. I find it much easier to learn the basics. You know, it's just helpful to have somebody teach you the basics first. And I think everyone should you know, try to do that. Some people are just really good at going out and learning it on their own. And if you're that kind of person, then that's fantastic. But I'm personally not very good at learning all the basics on my own. It does help to have somebody teach me what is what. And so, yeah, you know, a lot of it is just, you know, just stumbling across what's available to you, looking into your life. What can you afford? Where can you travel to get that information? Like, what do you need? And then trying to find something that fits what you need. And, you know, I provided all of the resources that I personally have tried to use to build up, you know, my knowledge of computational ethnography. But I understand how it can be difficult. And, you know, sometimes it depends on just so many things, how much time you have to invest in learning something like R or Python, you know, versus just using what's available, you know, and through, you know, UCINet or whatever. So, yeah, I don't know. Is that helpful?
Yeah, no, it's perfect.
I just have a quick question. When you think about ethnography, right, it's all about the cultural context, right? You capture that. So how does computational ethnography keep that relevance? How do we make sure that the cultural context also captured?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Wow, that's a big question. So, and it's a difficult question. Inevitably, whenever you do something, any kind of computation, some information is going to be lost. That's true. And I think it's really what you have to do is account for it, you know, verbally, you know, in your research. Just because you're doing computational ethnography doesn't mean you have to take the qualitative part out. It doesn't mean this isn't exploratory anymore. It's still an exploratory research. You still have to have a good grasp on what you're trying to say, and you have to say it in your actual papers, and say it when you're doing a presentation, and acknowledge that, okay, this is limited, and I'm just going to explain why it's limited and what else we're missing from these data. And the data should be a tool for helping to explain cultural context, but it itself isn't always going to just say everything you want it to say.
It makes me think now, because if you want to keep the kind of the qualitative aspect of it, but also bringing in the computational aspect of it, would it be maybe you know, in research we always talk about mixed method, right? But would it be this time, right? It would not be maybe a mixed method, but maybe it's going to be like a mixed approach kind of thing. I'm just pushing, you know, pushing the barrier, because listening to you, I'm like, okay, so we have this computational aspect to my analysis of the data, but also I'm going to provide that qualitative wide description, in-depth description. So if I'm combining both, maybe this is going to be something like, you know, mixed approach to data analysis.
Yeah, the combination of mixed methods, you know, sort of type of approach is always going to give you a better type of perspective.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. So will we then say that we will say then that computational ethnography falls on the big, you know, research approaches, saying that, is it on the qualitative research or is it on the quantitative research? If we wanted to go through the tradition, how will you say? I mean, where does it fall?
You know, the qualitative and quantitative, they contribute different things, and they both are useful, but you have to ask yourself, you know, what am I trying to do with my research? Am I trying to ask why or how something is happening? And if that's the case, qualitative is your best. You should lean towards that direction. Maybe use computational ethnography to help illustrate your points, add some interesting, you know, things to just make all these words, you know, into something simple, so people could be like, okay, that I get what they're saying. But if you're asking something, does something happen or not? Is this the case or is it not the case? Then something like quantitative research is probably your best option. It's not going to explore. It's just asking, does this happen or does this not happen? And that could be, it could, if you're trying to ask both questions, then it could be good to add both of those in, you know. So yeah, and also, you know, cultural context. I can imagine you somebody could come up with different ways of having multiple analyses for different cultural perspectives. You don't have to just use one graph. You can use many different graphs and look at an issue from different perspectives. If you feel like that's relevant to your research and you feel like, okay, I'm going to look at the issues within this time period, and I'm going to look at them within this time period, and I'm going to look at, you know, the feminist perspective, and I'm going to look at this, you know, whatever other perspective, and I'm going to compare these perspectives. It's possible to divide up your computations into very specific subsections and have many different types of graphs, you know. So yeah, that's another way of doing it if you really wanted to try to systematically look at different cultural contexts.
I'll say that, yeah, go ahead. But I just wanted to conclude by saying that, so I would say then that if I'm going back to the tradition of research, so maybe computational ethnography falls more on the qualitative, right? Qualitative, you know, approach to research. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, the paradigm is it's taking a lot of more of the quantitative, the NST paradigm, and it's kind of, you know, making ethnography kind of, or qualitative research pull a little bit more towards NST, and that's not necessarily fair. It's it's not necessarily right. But it is the world in which we live, and you know, and so those critiques are important. It does make us better. I think it helps us to look at ourselves critically, and at the same time, we should be making critiques of NST and saying, well, you know, sometimes you're overgeneralizing this. What about context? You know, I think we should be pushing back too, for sure. But yeah, it does push us a little bit towards the NST paradigm, and there's critiques to be made, you know, about doing something like that.
The one question that I had was in regards to reporting the data. A lot of the example that you show can be best understood when they're really interactive, especially like sort of looking at the beautiful graphic of the stuff, the picture with the church. How do you then replicate? What are some of the steps in sort of reporting that data in a flat publication that often, like you said earlier, tend to be black and white?
Yeah. Yeah, that gets, you know, there's a difference between doing the analysis in the privacy of your own home and actually showing those results, because there can be a lot of information there. I used a concept analysis in one of my articles, and I just posted the whole thing. I didn't modify it, I just posted the whole thing, and then I discussed, you know, how it worked. It was luckily a pretty simple result. It was simple to interpret, and that's why I used it. If you're going to use something very complex, that looks complex, you know, then you might want to consider how much space you have to actually look at that. And if it's too complex, you might not have space in your journal article to talk about it, but maybe you have space in a book to talk about it. So how are you, you know, in what format are you talking about this? And do you really have the space? Those are things to really consider when you choose the graph in the first place. And when you model it, you know, you might model it for yourself, and you might not post that that model in any kind of a paper or publication. That might just be for you to look through and analyze. And then you could always discuss that and say, I use this to analyze it. I'm not showing an image, but this is what I use to analyze the data. That might be an option if you think it's just too complex to talk about. But I see nothing wrong with posting it even as an appendix in a paper. Just do the whole model and then choose a specific aspect of the model and guide people to focus on that, you know, and instead of just posting it and allowing it to speak for itself. It's really important to guide people through your model and say, now if you look at this, you can see that this hierarchy is different than this hierarchy over here, and that is interesting, and I'm going to explain why. You don't have to discuss the entire model. Just pick something that's interesting about it and then talk about that interesting thing. Yeah, I think that's probably the best way to go about doing that.
there anyone else that have questions? We're also going to feature the presentation on the website too, for those of you who inquired about viewing it as a resource, just so you know.
All right. With that being said, we want to say thank you. Do you have more questions? I think we don't have any more.
I think that's it. Yeah.
That's it, right? Okay, so we want to say thank you so much. We're going to share the link to the website now. We have sessions coming as well. And then we just want to make sure that you kind of, we just want to say thank you, first of all, for you joining us and then getting into this conversation. I think it's really great. Thanks to Jacqueline. We want to say thank you to Claire that founded this organization. Actually not Melinda Mellon Foundation, through Claire, that actually founded this program and supported it. So we want to say thank you. We want to say thank you to all those who, behind, the scene, really work with us to kind of make sure that this happens. So again, thank you to our speaker today. I just wanted to share the site, but I think I'm going to put it on this on the chat, in the chat, so that everybody can access it. And we had our upcoming sessions are coming. We have another session that's going to be on the 6th of July. Please go in there and register. It's going to be on computational archival sciences, and it's going to be a great talk. So we say thank you to all of you. And then without saying, we wish you a wonderful afternoon or morning, depending on where you found yourself. And then thank you for joining us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.